In this video, we're going to talk about state transitions in Next.js 14 using the useTransition hook. We're going to see three different use cases. The first one is a state transition where you would mark a state update as a transition. So your UI is still responsive even though the state is updating, because state updates usually are synchronous. So when the state is updating and a re-render is happening, the UI is blocked. The user can't actually do anything else. But with transitions, that state update or that transition can be interrupted with another decision or state update from the user. So for example, here, if the user wants to go to this team tab, which is a slow render component, you see I clicked on it, but it takes a little while because I am rendering a lot of team members inside of this tab. And this is a slow. So if I go to the about, I don't have transitions right now. So if I click on the team and immediately click on the contact after, it just froze a little bit before changing to the contact. So I'm going to demonstrate this one more time. So if I click on the team and then immediately click on the contact, it doesn't switch the tab because when we first clicked on the team, it went through that re-render process and it blocks the UI, and the user wasn't able to interrupt that state update to change to a different tab. Now, let me just bring a transition here inside of the code and see how this would look like with transitions. So let me refresh the app here. So I'm on the about page. I'm going to click on the team and then immediately click on the contact. And you would see this time it would immediately switch to the tab, which means that state update gets interrupted and switches to the contact tab. So let's see this in action, team and then immediately contact, and just immediately change to the contact. So I'm going to do it again, team and then contact. It just interrupts that state update because it is marked as a transition, which is not going to block the UI. So it stays responsive even when a re-render or a state update is happening, which allows for a better user experience. Now, the second use case we're going to see is what we have already talked about or seen in the optimistic UI video. So if you haven't watched that video, I'm going to include a link in the cart or the description somewhere for you to watch it. But inside of that example, when we were calling the @optimistic dispatch function for marking these tasks as complete, because we were not doing so inside of a server action, we had to wrap it inside of a transition. We're going to dive into the code and see all of these implementations in action. So don't worry if it doesn't make sense right now. I'm just showing or demonstrating the use cases now, and then we're going to jump into the code later on. And the third use case that we want to implement together is adding a loading spinner or a pending UI. So we have this movie app. Again, this is another project that we have done on the channel for implementing search, infinite scrolling, and loading skeleton in Next.js 14. Again, I'm going to include links to these projects. But one thing that I had done here is to add a pending UI. So for example, here, when I'm trying to search for a term, let's say Godfather, you can see that loading UI, loading spinner shows up. It just happened very fast. So let me just try something else. Let's throttle our network. And now if I search for Godfather, you see that loading spinner shows up until the request is completed. So there's a lot to cover. We're going to start by understanding the useTransition hook, the syntax, and then once that's done, we're going to jump into the code and actually implement all these three different use cases. So let's start by understanding what transitions or state transitions are. Now, as I mentioned, transitions let you update the state without blocking the UI. They allow you to keep the user interface responsive even on slow devices. Now, with a transition, your UI stays responsive in the middle of a re-render. For example, if the user clicks a tab, but then changes their mind and click another tab, just like the example we showed earlier, they can do that without waiting for the first re-render to finish, because once you mark a state as a transition, it can be interrupted by user interactions or other state updates. Now, what is the convention to actually use transitions? There's two ways that you can mark a state update as transitions. The first one is using the useTransition hook. This is a hook, and obviously you can use it in React components or your custom hooks. And the second way is the start transition function, which is useful if you wanted to use it outside of a component. So let's dive into the useTransition hook. As I mentioned, this is a hook that allows you to update state without blocking the UI. You can call the useTransition hook at the top level of your component, and it returns two values to you. One is an isPending state. This is to show if a transition is pending. This is what we're going to use later on to implement loading UI or a pending UI. It also returns this start transition function, which you're going to use to wrap your state updates to mark them as transitions. It does not take any parameters, as I mentioned, it returns an array with exactly two items, the isPending and the start transition. So in a nutshell, you call the useTransition, you get these two values, you have a state, in this case, it's a tab. We're going to see this inside the code in a second. But inside of the way that you're handling the state update, you're going to wrap this state updater function inside of a start transition function. Now, the start transition function receives another function. We call this a scope, and this is where you're going to implement another state update using your state update functions. Now, this is start transition function that you get back from the useTransition hook can also be imported from React directly, and it's exactly the same function where you can call this and pass a function to it where you can make your state updates or mark your state updates as transitions. Now, as far as the parameters goes, whether you're getting start transition directly from React or you're getting it back from calling useTransition hook, as I mentioned, you just pass a function to it that's called a scope. And inside of this function, you would update some state by calling one or more state update functions. Now, React is going to call this scope function and mark all of the state updates as transitions. Now, with this out of the way, let's just jump into the code and implement this or see this in action. Let me just make this code a bit bigger, so hopefully you can see a bit better. Let me close this off, go to the app, and let's explain from a high level what we're doing here. So inside of our app, we have this page component. Close this off. Inside of our page, we are rendering these different tabs. So we have these tab buttons up top. This is going to allow us to change the tab. We are holding a state for this tab. So the active tab, we start from the about tab, and then we can use these buttons to basically select a different tab. And down here, depending on what tab is now active, we are rendering that specific component, which is, just to show you, the about one is showing a card component from Chat.cn to render some content. Now, as I mentioned, one of these tabs, being the team, is a slow render tab. So the component is a slow. So let's dive right into that. So inside of our team component, what we're doing is that we are rendering a lot of these person components. Each one of them are delaying the render by 1 millisecond. So therefore, we're rendering 1,000 of them. So this is going to at least slow down the render for 1 second, just so we can demonstrate this state update interruptions with or without the use of transition. So inside of our page, when we call these buttons, we call this select tab function. And right now, I'm wrapping this state update inside of this start transition that I got back out of our useTransition hook. So let's try this without, just as I showed you in the beginning. So right now, we're not using a transition, and we're just calling this state update function. So let's just refresh our app. And now you can see if I click on the team and immediately try to click on the contact page, because the state update and the re-render is blocking the UI because it happens synchronously, I won't be able to switch to the tab, contact tab immediately. So it just freezes the UI for a second. So let's try that. So I'm clicking on the team and immediately on the contact. Nothing happens until that cycle or re-render finishes. So the UI becomes responsive again and receives the click event and switches the tab. Again, let's bring the start transition back and see how this is different. Let me refresh the app. And now let's see how this is different when I click on the team and immediately click on the contact. But because now I have marked this state update of switching the tabs as a transition, they can be interrupted by another state update. So now I click on the team and immediately on the contact, you can see it immediately switches the tab because this state update is marked as a transition and can be interrupted. Now, before going to the next example, which is optimistic UI, let's go back to our notes and I want to talk about some caveats. Now, the point that I just mentioned is what we have over here. So a state update marked as a transition will be interrupted by other state updates. So inside of our app here, when I'm clicking on this, this is marked as a transition, but it can be interrupted if the user changes their mind and clicks on something else, right? So that's number one. It is the use case for using transitions, but it is something that you want to keep in mind. And because this is the case, you should not use a transition for a state variable that controls an input. So let's say you have an input, a controlled input inside of a form. Typically, you have a state and onChange handler handling that state update or controls the input. If you mark that as a transition, now anything else can interrupt that, and it would just be a bad UI for your user because they can't see what they're typing because it might get interrupted by other state updates. Now, another caveat is that the function you pass into start transition needs to be synchronous. So the state update needs to happen immediately. You can't call set timeout inside of a start transition. You can, but that state update won't be marked as a transition. Now, as I mentioned, useTransition is a hook. It can be called inside of a component. If you need to start a transition somewhere else, for example, from a data library, you can call the start transition function that you can import directly from React. Now, start transition function on its own, when you import it, does not provide a way to track whether a transition is pending. If you remember, when we call this useTransition hook, it returns this is pending, which we're going to use inside of our app to show a different loading UI for our tabs. But the start transition function itself, when you import it directly from React, doesn't have that showing indicator. So if you do need that pending indicator, you need to use the useTransition hook. Now, going back to our application, when I click on this team tab, look, it changes to loading. And while it is loading, I see a different text there. So what I'm doing here, I'm using this is pending. Now for this tab button, that's for the team, I'm passing down this is pending. And inside of this tab button, I'm saying if the is pending is true, say loading. So this is the same technique that we're going to use to add loading UI in our movie app in a second. But just so you know that you are getting this is pending back, this is going to be a loading UI or a pending state while a state update is in transition. Now let's go to the second example, which is from our video about optimistic UI. Let me just change the VS Code here to also show that one. Now, as I mentioned, when you are using the use optimistic hook, you're getting an optimistic state as well as a dispatch function. Now, you should call that dispatch function inside of a server action to do the mutation on the server, and then you optimistically update the UI. Now, if this is not very comfortable or familiar to you, watch the video that we have dedicated to optimistic UI, and you would understand. But here, we just want to dive into one of the components, which is the to-do item component, which is using the use optimistic hook to get some optimistic to-dos back. This is responsible for marking these tasks as complete or checking and unchecking them. This use optimistic hook is returning this update to do. This is a dispatch function to actually optimistically update our UI, but we are not calling this update to do inside of an action or a form action, which requires us to wrap this dispatch function with a start transition or mark this update as a transition. So down here on the unchecked change event handler, I'm wrapping this handle change function. This is where, or inside of which, I'm actually calling this dispatch optimistic UI function. So I'm wrapping everything inside of this start transition to mark this state updates as a transition, and that's how the optimistic UI works if you're not calling it from an action. And this is a valid use case for using server actions, as I also mentioned in that other video, There's different ways you can use server actions. One would be the action prop of a form. You can also pass them to your event handlers for a button here. It's a checkbox, but under the hood, it's a button. Nonetheless, one of the use cases for optimistic UI can happen when you're calling a server action outside of a form action, for which you need to, again, mark it as a transition. Long explanation, but hopefully it makes sense. Now, the third use case would be our movie app. So let me just change again to that code. Now, in this movies app, we implemented a loading skeleton to show up when the user is trying to search for a movie using suspense boundaries, and this await component that receives a promise and returns the data to this children component. So if you haven't watched that video, definitely give it a watch, because it uses a pattern that lifts up the state up to the URL. So if you're using the URL as a way to communicate from our client side back to the server side to implement this search functionality and also the loading UI. But in this example, I wanted to also show that we could have added a loading UI to the search box using transitions. So inside of this search component, this is where we are rendering this input element. So from a high level, we are debouncing this input. So we have this state that's text that's controlling the text input. We are debouncing the user input by 750 milliseconds. So for them to finish typing, or that we're not hitting our server on any keystroke, we're debouncing this text input. And once this query or the debounced value changes every time, what we're doing is that we are calling the router.push method and passing that search query to our URL, which is going to then load a different set of movies inside of our server components and render the UI. Now, what I had done here to change it, this start transition is new. So the previous video didn't have the start transition. It was just calling the router.push. But now I've just wrapped this router.push calls inside of a transition. So I'm marking this as state updates. Now the URL is also another state. So I'm marking this as state updates as transitions. And the benefit that I'm getting out of doing it is not to interrupt them, is to just get this is pending value back so I can show a loading spinner. Down here, all I had done is that I'm saying inside of this text box, if the is pending is true, show a loading spinner. So therefore, if I now go ahead and type in Bruce Lee here, you see that loading spinner indicating that a search is happening. So we've received the search and something is happening. Whereas if I don't have this, assuming that we don't have any other loading UI, just turn this back into a slower network again. Now if I search for Godfather, you can see without that loading spinner, the user doesn't even know that our app has received the search and is actually fetching some data. So what we had before was through this suspense. So if I turn this back on, so you know what we were doing before, just refresh this again. You saw the loading spinner flashing for a second there, but let me just refresh this app. So this is what we had before, where anytime that we would have this search, we would show this loading spinner, or we would show this loading skeleton while the search was going through before showing the results. Now, another way that I wanted to show here by removing this suspense was to then bring in this is pending that we get back out of the transition, just another way of showing a loading UI, as you can see here. If I now go and search for Godfather again, these are the two terms that I keep searching. Let me just no throttle and refresh the app. Let's search for Jackie Chan this time. You show the loading spinner showing up. And there you have it. We learned about state transitions in Next.js 14 using the useTransition hook that not only gives you the start transition function back, which you can use to mark any state update as transition, but it also gives you back the is pending state, which you can use to implement loading UI or pending UI. Now, to recap the three different use cases that you can have with the state transitions, the first one was to make your UI responsive. So when a state update is happening, a re-render is happening, for whatever reason it's slow, your UI stays responsive to user interactions so they can interrupt that state update if they change their mind, for example, to change the tabs. The second use case for us was when we were using the use optimistic hook, but we were calling the dispatch function not from inside of a form action, but just from an event handler on a button. We needed to wrap that state optimistic update into a start transition, or we needed to mark it as a transition. And the third use case was actually wrapping the router.push that communicates a URL state inside of a transition, or mark it as a transition to get the is pending back, so we can communicate to the user that something is happening. If you show a loading spinner, that shows that their request is in process instead of showing nothing. So I hope you found this video useful. If you have any questions, like always, hit me up in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.